Have you ever felt small in a room where your soul wanted to roar? Have you ever bitten your tongue not out of peace, but out of programming? You weren't born weak. That doubt you carry, the hesitation, the self-blame, the shrinking, it was taught to you, praised into you, because society doesn't fear weakness, it fears untrained power. And from the moment you showed signs of fire, they began to smother it with polite words and silent punishments. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And so here you are, calling your fear humility, calling your silence maturity. But the truth is, you're not weak, you're just unfinished. They taught you early that being quiet was respectful, that being agreeable was wise, that waiting your turn, softening your tone, and lowering your gaze made you a good person. But what they really meant was, be easier to control, be pleasant, be predictable, be a version of yourself that caused no disruption, no discomfort, no confrontation, not for your sake, but for theirs. It started in the subtle ways, when you expressed yourself honestly and were told, "That's not nice," when your natural confidence was called arrogance, when standing up for yourself meant you were being difficult. It was a grooming of your personality, one soft correction at a time. As a child, you didn't question it. You wanted to be loved, so when you were loud and they went quiet, you went quiet too. When you spoke with certainty and they looked away, you doubted yourself. The punishment was never loud. It was subtle, emotional, conditional. So you learned to trade your strength for acceptance. And every time you did, they praised you for being well-adjusted. Not because it was true, but because you stopped being inconvenient. You smiled through discomfort. You apologized for existing. You made yourself easier to swallow so you wouldn't be rejected. And every time you did, the real you got smaller. You weren't praised for your strength. You were praised for your compliance, for being digestible. And so you learned to disappear in plain sight. You weren't encouraged to take up space. You were trained to be polite about your pain. The lie is that humility is always a virtue, but often it's just fear dressed up as virtue. You weren't being humble. You were hiding. You were adapting. You were shrinking into a version of yourself that could survive in a world that didn't want to feel threatened by your strength. Real humility doesn't erase you. It grounds you. It allows you to own your truth without needing applause or permission. But what they trained into you wasn't humility. It was submission. You were taught to fear your own voice, to see discomfort as failure, to see directness as aggression. And so, slowly, you became fluent in hesitation, a master of softening every sentence, of smiling through violation, of nodding while your boundaries were stepped on. You began to second-guess your instincts, doubt your thoughts, censor your truth, not because you were unsure, but because you were trained to expect punishment for being certain. The lie became internalized. Now you hear a voice in your head every time you want to speak boldly. It tells you to soften, to shrink, to wait. But that voice isn't you. It's a memory of conditioning. Every time you lowered your eyes instead of holding their gaze, you trained your nervous system to equate visibility with danger. Every time you stayed silent to keep the peace, you taught yourself that conflict is worse than self-abandonment. And every time you said it's fine when it wasn't, you reaffirmed the lie that your truth is a threat. You began to feel proud of how little space you took up. You mistook smallness for maturity. You mistook passivity for peace. You mistook guilt for empathy. But strength doesn't require apology. Truth doesn't require softness. And peace doesn't require permission. They told you that loud was dangerous, that confidence was arrogance, that pride meant you were flawed. But none of that was true. They were afraid of what they couldn't shape, afraid of what they couldn't guilt into silence. Humility isn't supposed to hurt. It isn't supposed to feel like self-erasure. If your humility comes at the expense of your truth, it's not humility. It's trauma in disguise. And that trauma lives in your posture, in your breath, in the hesitation before every sentence. It's there in the sorry you whisper before you've done anything wrong. It's in the way you flinch at your own power. But you are not the problem. You were simply trained to think you were. This isn't your fault. It's your programming. But now, it's your responsibility. Because the longer you wear humility as a disguise, the further you drift from your edge, the place where your real self lives. You don't need to become someone new. You need to stop apologizing for the fire that was always there. You were not born to be agreeable. You were born to be aligned. And real alignment doesn't always make people comfortable. Sometimes it shakes the room. Let it shake. In the next section, we expose how this conditioning isn't just personal, it's systemic. From school to society, you were trained to submit before you even learned how to think. Let's break the system down. This didn't start with your parents. It didn't start with one moment. It started with a structure, a system built not to empower you, but to prepare you to submit. Before you ever had a sense of self, you were enrolled into obedience. The playground wasn't just a place to play. It was a testing ground to see who would conform and who had to be corrected. School was never just about education. It was about hierarchy, desks in rows, bells to condition your time, rules that rewarded silence more than insight. It wasn't designed to elevate your mind. It was built to tame your impulses. Spontaneity was discouraged. Creativity was labeled a distraction. Confidence was interpreted as disrespect. You weren't taught how to think. You were taught how to pause before speaking, how to wait for permission, how to memorize the right answers and ignore your questions. You learned quickly that being right at the wrong time was worse than being wrong altogether. You were conditioned to associate safety with predictability and danger with individuality. Your ability to adapt was praised, not your ability to lead. You weren't rewarded for your insight, you were rewarded for your compliance. And just like that, your brilliance became something you hid. Your energy became something you suppressed. You dimmed to match the environment. Because every time you dared to shine, you felt the quiet weight of rejection, the disapproving stares, the subtle shift in tone from authority figures, the shame that followed. Robert Greene once said, "When you show yourself to the world and display your talents, you naturally stir all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity." That resentment, you felt it from teachers, from coaches, even from peers who had long surrendered to the system and saw your defiance as a threat, not to them, but to the fragile structure that kept them comfortable. So you adapted again. You toned yourself down. You translated your intuition into politeness. You replaced your natural momentum with constant self-monitoring, and the system celebrated you for it. You graduated with honors, but you also graduated unsure of who you are when no one's grading you. You learned to win by fitting in, to succeed by suppressing the parts of you that stood out. The system didn't just mold your behavior, it molded your identity. You see, control doesn't require chains when you've been trained to leash yourself. You apologize before sharing your ideas. You preface every boundary with, "if that's okay." You instinctively scan the room to make sure your presence isn't too much. And still, you wonder why you feel disconnected from yourself. But that confusion isn't yours. It's the residue of years spent navigating a world that asked you to perform instead of express. The system didn't care who you were. It cared how well you followed. And now, even when you're free, you're not. Because the voices are still in your head, not literal ones, but those internalized reactions, the flinch, the doubt, the hesitation. They don't come from truth. They come from training. And here's the terrifying part. You believed them. Not because you were weak, but because you were young. Because the system doesn't just punish defiance, it rewrites reality. It teaches you that your discomfort is a sign of failure, not growth. That your longing for something different is rebellion, not intelligence. That your deep inner voice should be silenced, not followed. But what if the system is wrong? What if everything you suppressed is exactly what you were meant to protect? What if your resistance was never the problem, but the evidence that you were still alive underneath the programming? There's a reason people wake up in their 30s or 40s feeling lost. It's not because they're broken. It's because the system succeeded, and now the mask no longer fits. But it's not too late to rebuild. It starts with remembering, with asking, who was I before I learned to shrink? With challenging the rules you follow without questioning. With realizing that conformity kept you safe, but it also kept you small. The system wants predictability, but your soul wants power. You weren't built to repeat. You were built to disrupt. And that's terrifying for a world that runs on obedience. So let it be terrifying, because you'll never reclaim your strength inside a structure built to mute it. In the next section, we look at the weaponization of kindness, how your empathy was exploited to keep you soft and quiet, and how to finally unlearn the guilt they used to control you. Kindness was never your weakness, but they trained you to believe it was your purpose. They told you to be good, to be generous, to turn the other cheek, not because they valued your heart, but because they saw how easy it was to bend. It began with subtle praise. You're such a good listener. You're so mature for your age. You're always the one keeping the peace. And you wore those words like medals because they sounded like love. But what they really were was instruction. A manual on how to keep you soft enough to manipulate, compassionate enough to endure, selfless enough to disappear without complaint. And so, every time you were hurt, you forgave too quickly. Every time someone crossed a line, you redrew it closer to them. Every time you were neglected, you tried harder to earn their attention. That wasn't kindness. That was survival, disguised as virtue. They taught you to confuse emotional labor with connection, to believe that enduring someone's disrespect was noble, to call your exhaustion generosity, to silence your instincts in the name of love. Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." So they used yours instead. When they couldn't bear to confront their guilt, they placed it in your hands. When they felt shame, they transferred it to your silence. You became their shield, and then they called you kind for holding it. But kindness without boundaries is self-erasure. Forgiveness without change is codependence. Empathy without discernment is exploitation. You were never taught how to say no without guilt, how to walk away without explanation, how to protect yourself without feeling cruel. Because if you had known how, you would have stopped dancing for people who only clapped when you bled. They praised your empathy as long as it served them. But the moment you used it on yourself, the applause stopped. They said, "You've changed." What they meant was, you stopped letting me use you. You weren't too sensitive. You were too honest for their comfort. You weren't dramatic. You were finally refusing to swallow what had always been poison. But unlearning this isn't just about strength. It's about grieving the version of you that believed love was earned through sacrifice. That thought peace was worth self-abandonment. That mistook suffering for meaning. Kindness isn't weakness, it's clarity. It's knowing who deserves your time, your energy, your softness, and who doesn't. Real kindness doesn't demand that you bleed quietly. It doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't require you to tolerate harm for the sake of keeping the peace. You are allowed to be warm and unbending, compassionate and firm, generous and guarded, because the moment you begin to protect your energy, the takers will call it selfish. Let them. The moment you stop over-explaining your boundaries, the manipulators will call it cold. Let them. The moment you choose yourself without guilt, the ones who fed on your guilt will call it betrayal. Let them. Because the version of you who apologized for needing space, who explained away mistreatment, who performed peace while breaking inside, that version was created by people who feared your wholeness. And when you stop performing kindness as a shield, you step into a new kind of power, calm, unwavering, unapologetic. They will not celebrate your awakening, but that was never their role. You do not owe softness to those who sharpened their edges on you. You do not owe presence to those who vanished when you needed them. You do not owe silence to anyone who mistook your kindness for permission. The next time someone tells you that you've changed, look them in the eye and say, "I finally remembered who I was before you trained me to forget." In the next section, we explore what it takes to retrain your nervous system, how to reclaim your instincts, rebuild inner safety, and unlearn the guilt that kept you obedient. This is where healing begins, not through revenge, but through remembrance. Healing doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins in the micro moments, in the pause before you apologize for something that didn't require apology, in the breath you take before over-explaining your boundary, in the decision to stay present in your body, even when it wants to run. You don't untrain the world. You retrain your nervous system. You reclaim the wiring, slowly, deliberately, because your body remembers every time you swallowed your truth to stay safe. It remembers the tension of smiling through betrayal, the way your throat tightened every time you said yes when you meant no, the flinch in your spine when someone raised their voice, the silent script you repeated, "Don't make it worse, don't be dramatic, just survive." But surviving is not living, and those memories, they're not fixed. They're habits, habits your nervous system learned under pressure, and anything learned can be unlearned. The first step is noticing. Noticing when your voice shakes and staying anyway. Noticing the urge to explain and choosing stillness. Noticing when guilt shows up and asking who planted it there. You're not overreacting. You're overconditioned, and that conditioning runs deep. So you must meet it with depth. It takes repetition to overwrite the script, to walk into rooms with your shoulders back, to speak without asking for validation, to say, "I need space," without apologizing for it. At first, it will feel unnatural. It will feel like rebellion. But that's only because obedience has been mistaken for identity. You are not your reactions. You are not your reflexes. You are not the flinch you inherited. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Your strength was never gone. It was just buried under layers of learned helplessness. So you start small. You say no to things that drain you. You leave conversations that make you doubt yourself. You protect your solitude like it's sacred, because it is. And when the guilt arrives, because it will, you welcome it, not to obey it, but to study it. Because guilt doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're breaking a pattern. You begin reparenting yourself, giving your inner voice the authority it always needed. You say, "I hear you. I trust you. You don't have to prove anything today." You stop seeking validation from people who only respected your silence. You stop shrinking around those who never grew. You stop accepting crumbs from tables you were meant to build yourself. Your instincts are not dangerous. Your sensitivity is not a flaw. Your intuition is not irrational. These are not liabilities. They are language. The original language you spoke before you were taught to translate everything through other people's comfort. Retraining yourself is not a performance. It's not about becoming louder or tougher or colder. It's about becoming clearer, sharper, truer. It's about rooting into yourself so deeply that no storm outside of you can pull you out of alignment. And yes, people will resist the new you. They'll miss the version of you who made them comfortable, who bent without breaking, who broke without showing it. But that version of you was built for their benefit, not your liberation. Let them miss you, let them misunderstand you, because the more you honor your truth, the less access they will have to your energy, and in time, your nervous system will begin to trust you again. It will stop bracing for punishment. It will stop expecting guilt. It will stop associating stillness with danger, and that, more than anything, is power. This is not revenge. It is not rebellion. This is remembrance, a return to the you before the training, before the performance, before the mask. The healing is subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but one day you'll speak without the tremble, say no without explanation, hold your gaze without apology, and you'll know, I didn't become someone new. I just stopped being who they trained me to be. In the next section, we reclaim power, not through domination, but through detachment. We'll explore how your silence, your absence, and your clarity are stronger than any argument they trained you to lose. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to no longer explain yourself. Sometimes it's leaving without a warning, not in anger, in clarity. Because true power isn't loud, it's unshakable. It doesn't seek to be seen. It simply exists, rooted in self-trust. They trained you to believe that being powerful meant being dominant, that you had to convince, control, or conquer. But that was their fear speaking, not truth. Because real power doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, it doesn't plead. Real power withdraws, it observes, it chooses, and above all, it doesn't need to be understood. You reclaim your strength the moment you stop seeking evidence for your worth in someone else's reaction. When their silence no longer shakes you. When their approval no longer dictates your next move. When their discomfort doesn't make you question your truth. You reclaim your power when peace feels more satisfying than being right, when walking away becomes your form of self-respect, when stillness is not passivity, but precision. Because they trained you to believe your power came from reaction, that your voice only mattered if it was validated, that your boundary only counted if it was accepted. But you now know boundaries don't need consensus, they need conviction. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. You were born to be sovereign, not submissive. And so you begin detaching from their rhythm, from their guilt, from their projections. You stop engaging in battles designed to drain you. You stop proving, explaining, appeasing. That is not weakness, that is evolution. They'll say you've become distant, cold, unreachable, but you haven't gone cold, you've gone clear. And that clarity threatens them more than your anger ever did. Because clarity isn't loud, but it's undeniable. You no longer shout to be heard. You no longer rise to their bait. You simply exit the arena. And in doing so, you change the dynamic. Their chaos no longer affects your pace. Their manipulation no longer hijacks your peace. Their disapproval no longer edits your identity. You're no longer seeking to be chosen. You're choosing yourself. And that choice, that silent, steady, unapologetic choice, rewires everything. You no longer explain why you're unavailable. You simply become unavailable. You no longer seek closure in conversation. You create it through detachment. You no longer perform your healing for their comfort. You embody it for your freedom. There's a moment in healing where you stop fearing who leaves and start noticing who returns. Not because you changed for them, but because you changed for you, and the ones who can't recognize this version of you. They never knew you. They only knew who you were trained to be. Power is no longer about winning. It's about walking. Power is leaving the room, not slamming the door. It's choosing silence, not because you're defeated, but because the conversation no longer deserves your voice. You become dangerous the moment you stop trying to be liked. The moment you stop managing people's comfort, the moment you honor your intuition over their expectation. You do it without spectacle. You do it without warning. You do it without apology. Because power, real power, is the quiet certainty that you've come home to yourself. And the more you practice it, the more you begin to feel its weight in your bones. You move differently. You speak differently. You no longer chase moments. You let them come. You no longer cling to relationships. You let them prove themselves. You no longer bend to avoid discomfort. You let discomfort pass through you without negotiation. And the world begins to respond, not with applause, but with hesitation, with curiosity, with a subtle shift in how they approach you, because they can sense that something in you is untouchable now. That is the essence of true strength. You're not trying to inspire fear. You're embodying respect, first for yourself, then from others. They can sense that you've stopped performing. They can feel that you've stopped playing roles. They can see that you no longer wear the mask they handed you. This isn't a transformation, it's a return to the version of you that existed before they layered doubt on top of your voice, before they turned your empathy against you, before they molded you into something safe. Now, you are no longer safe for their agenda. You are only safe for your truth. You are not weak. You never were. You were just trained to believe that your power was dangerous. And now that you remember, they no longer have access. If this spoke to a part of you that's been silent too long, don't explain why. Just feel it. And when you're ready for more content like this, truth without noise, power without permission, subscribe silently, strategically, without apology.